like to do is focus on, today I want to talk about autonomous learning, and I'm going to share my observations of how the students that I taught took ownership of their learning within online spaces. I work at Macquarie University International College, where I teach academic literacies, and I'll be sharing some data that I collected when we all first went online. Before I do any of that, though, I think it's important to establish what we mean by autonomy. And one of the most commonly cited definitions is that autonomy means taking charge of your learning. And that's perfectly fine. That's a great definition. But I have problems with the way this has been adopted in the theory and practice in education. Often when we talk about autonomy, there are views that it refers to some kind of independence. You know, the student who makes the independent decisions is seen as being autonomous, as these individualized actions. And I find that highly problematic because it assumes that learning is a purely mental activity that happens when one is just on their own. So there's no mention or no integration of social relationships in this view. And that's interesting because even though in practice, these are the views that are often associated with autonomy, in education itself, in terms of what learning is, we've moved away from this view of its purely mental activity. We've embraced the view that learning is a social participation. We've taken on this social constructionist view where we see learning happening when the individual takes part in the social practices of a community and adopts the identities in relation to that. So then taking charge is not doing things in isolation or independently, but it's creating a relationship with what is being learned, with the context, with yourself, and with available resources. So it's a much more complex activity and involves multiple elements. So it involves, I like this idea of taking ownership. So you make it your own by evaluating and shaping the space in which learning happens, whatever that space is, in order to meet your learning needs. And this doesn't just involve recognizing the opportunities that can assist your learning, but also potential constraints and finding ways of resolving those constraints. And Pennycook uses the word struggle because none of this is straightforward, universal, unproblematic. Evaluating the space in which we're learning or which a student is learning and shaping that to meet their needs, that's full of tension, contradiction, challenge, failures, starting again, etc. So what I wanted to look at was when we started online teaching at MUIC, I wanted to see how do students take ownership of this online space as an alternative now to the physical spaces that they were so used to and that I was so used to. I'm checking the time as well because I want to get through it all. At MUIC, we have 6-week blocks of teaching 2 hours a day. So it's quite intensive. And like many other institutions, we used Zoom to conduct our teaching and learning. And my initial interest was actually to look at how chat and the breakout rooms of Zoom are used for students to author their ways of learning. But when I went back to collect some data to actually find examples, the breakout rooms are not recorded. So I don't really have data that I'm comfortable using from the breakout rooms. So I'm only going to talk about the chat room, even though in my abstract I had said breakout rooms. Apologies for that. But so when I looked through the chat messages, I only looked at, for this presentation, I only looked at the comments that students made where they initiated it themselves. So not in response to a teacher question, and also not questions or comments that were made to me or any of my co-teachers in private. So the chat space as student initiated comments and publicly available, I wanted to find out what exactly is going on. And I found that that chat space is significant for 3 purposes. One was when students wanted to seek clarification or confirmation of their understandings. Second one was to demonstrate what they already knew. And with this, I mean, when I'm talking, about a particular content, the student gives an example or adds an explanation or relates it to their own experience, and thereby shows that they understand the topic. And also to share humor. And I'm actually going to show data from 1 and 3 purely because I thought those were the more interesting ones, and number 2 was much more straightforward. So let's have a look at the clarification confirmation, what I mean. So these are things where students feel they're not really sure if they understand it or know it, and they just need that okay from the teacher or from someone. Majority of those comments were about assessments, and possibly we shouldn't be surprised because if, say at Newark, we have 6-week terms, then obviously there are a number of assessments, and that's a major part of student life. Secondly, some of these comments were irrelevant to the ongoing lesson, but had some relevance to sort of broader university or college level issues. And a third set of comments were the catching up comments. So the student either drops out or is late or is distracted, gets a phone call, whatever the reason is. And when they log back in or when they, join the session, they kind of have lost what's going on. And I thought number 2 and 3 are in particular interesting because when we're in the physical classroom, the student would walk in, say late, and they'd sit and quickly ask the person next to them and say, hey, what are we doing? And then that person would answer. Or as the teacher, pre-COVID, as you're walking around close to students and they see you and they say, oh, when was that essay due again? What time was it? So these are really short conversations, take about 10 seconds, and they're often private. It's student to student or student to teacher. And so students transferred that to the chat room to fulfill this need that they had, which is great. And when I think about these in terms of, well, do they demonstrate autonomy? Well, they are engaged with the learning content, whether it's that lesson or broader issues. They are evaluating and shaping the learning space and using it to meet their learning needs. These students have identified the need they've identified that if they don't know the answers to these, it could potentially impede them from learning. So they want to find the answers to this. And so they're using this available resource to meet their learning needs, which is all good. But they're doing this, so in the physical classroom, this would happen privately possibly, but in the chat, this is the public chat, these are the public chat messages. They're doing this at the expense of other students who potentially don't need that information. So while it's an opportunity for some, it assists their learning, for others, it could be a hindrance because the student who already knows all of this, doesn't need the confirmation or clarification, is on time, is following, they're wasting their time. They're being distracted potentially with these messages. So this term, I kind of just let that happen because I didn't know kind of what else to do. But then the following term, I thought, well, there needs to be an alternative to the chat for these kinds of messages that are crucial for some students to move on, but not all. And what I did is I would start each lesson. So students logged in, immediately they went to a Google Doc, which laid out the lesson, brief plan. But what was important was as the class progressed, I would put up where we are. So if we're doing a Google Doc, if we're doing a video, where it was, etc. And there was always a place for just general questions. And in time, there weren't many of these, but in time, students started to just write these not specifically related to the lesson itself, but things that they felt they needed to find the answers to. A third group of comments, were about humor. And so these are the benefits of using humor in the classroom. What I'm going to show you is just a little snippet, and I just want you to read this, a little snippet of, I'll just give you 10 seconds to quickly read it. So this was in the chat while I was the teacher. I had a co-teacher in that class, and I was talking about reflective writing, and I had said something like, you can think of it as giving advice to other students. And so as you can see, the co-teacher, student 1 and student 6 are on task. they're following what's happening in the lesson. Student 2, however, picks up the word advice and transfers that to a different context and is talking about going to bed. Student 3, 4, and 5 recognize the humor that student 2 is creating and follow with it. Now, what is interesting here is one of the uses of humor is to be able to be humorous, to be able to function as humor. The parties involved need to have a shared set of understandings and meanings. So otherwise it doesn't work. So student 2 and 4 and 5 and 4 and 5 and 3 kind of could share those meanings and understandings and made it work, you know, in terms of being humorous. Now, some could look at this and say, well, student 2 obviously is disengaged, is lazy, is disruptive. This is a complete disruption to my teaching. Whereas I think the student there was no force for that student to write in this chat. They could have logged off and gone and slept or whatever it is that they wanted to do. But there was a need for that student to put this in the chat room and make it public. And there was a need for other students to join in on this humor. And I think that was what the online classroom lacked, was a community of learners, was that sense of community. And one thing that humor does is with that shared understanding, you create sort of a group within a group. So that student didn't just, bring some entertainment, but actually created a little group within the larger classroom that bonded and connected. And the other interesting thing is that student transformed the teaching agenda that I had and made it relevant to him and to his little group. And I just want to say it's interesting that often when it comes to autonomy, as teachers, we decide what counts as autonomy and who's autonomous and what it looks like. And often when a student's behavior doesn't match our teaching plan, we count that as not being autonomous. Whereas to me, what that student did, student 2 did, to me displays more autonomy than a student who sits in front of the screen, not engaged with any of the resources that we are making available. So overall, if I think about the chat room itself, I think for some it created opportunities to facilitate their learning. Some recognized limitations in the online environment and made adjustments to what they used. It contributed to developing this sense of community within the classroom. And it also made students think about how they're engaged with the resources and how each of those resources meet their learning needs. Now, I don't kind of want to end by saying, well, everything that the student does in the classroom counts as autonomy. But I think when we think of autonomy, I think we need to think about what is it that students are engaged with? How do they, well, what are the needs that they identify and what kind of actions do they engage in to meet those needs? And what's my role as a teacher to create change, make available resources for them to meet those needs? And sometimes those needs and those actions don't fit in with our plans, but that's perfectly fine because learning opportunities for both teachers and for students come out of these tensions and contradictions. So I do not see that as a problem at all. I feel like I've rushed. I hope I haven't, but that's it. I think I'm 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Thank you so much.